What if I told you that the price of gas, the strength of the US dollar, and even America's role as a world superpower are all tied to one deal made in the 1970s? Do you ever really think about the petrodollar system? Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Do You Ever Really Think About It podcast. Today we're breaking down what the petrodollar system is, why it was created, how it works, and most importantly, what it means for us right now. And by the end of this episode, you'll have the facts and the questions you need to decide for yourself. What do you really think about the petrodollar system? To understand the petrodollar system, we had to go back to the early 1970s. The United States was facing major economic challenges. Government spending was high, the dollar was losing value after being taken off the gold standard, and inflation was rising. At the same time, oil had become the lifeblood of the global economy, and countries around the world depended on it to keep their industries and economies running. All of these factors created the perfect storm that led nations to agree to the petrodollar system. So, what was happening in the world that made countries set up the petrodollar system? The US joined the Vienna, I believe, Vienna, and because of that, the US had been spending massively on the Vietnam War and on new social programs from the 1960s. That meant $2 million were flowing out of America. The United States was experiencing a massive trade deficit, a declining dollar, and a growth of national debt. The Bretton Woods system, which had pegged the dollar to gold, was under strain. Now, before I continue, the Bretton Woods system, established in 1944, was based on the gold standard, but it wasn't exactly the same as a pure gold standard. Here's how it worked. Under the Bretton Woods system, the US dollar was directly tied to gold. $35 equals 1 ounce of gold. Other countries' currencies were pegged to the US dollar, not directly to gold. So if your country wanted to stabilize your money, you tied it to the dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold. This meant that the dollar acted as the world reserve currency, backed by gold, and countries could exchange dollars for gold from the US if needed. And in 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window. The US no longer exchanged dollars for gold at a fixed rate. This broke the Bretton Woods system and created a crisis of confidence in the dollar worldwide. That leads us to the question: why was oil, not something else, chosen to be tied to the US dollar? In order to answer this question, you had to understand that in the early 1970s, the United States was the most trusted and powerful nation in the world. It held roughly about 80% of the world's gold, and other countries wanted access to it. The US could have honored all claims under the Bretton Woods gold standard, but domestic pressures, massive government spending, and international trade needs gave the government both the excuse and the incentive to move away from gold. Nixon's decision to close the gold window officially in 1971 ended the world's convertibility into gold. Once that happened, the dollar was no longer tied to a fixed amount of gold, which created the challenge of maintaining global demand for the US dollar. And we need that since we're a consumer nation. So for the US to maintain its value, it needed to be in constant demand. What was something in high demand? Oil. Nations needed oil to power their industries, transportation, and militaries. Without oil, modern industrial societies would grind to a halt. It was irreplaceable. That made oil the perfect commodity to create a guaranteed demand for the US dollar, because every nation would need dollars to buy oil. So, how did that lead to the petrodollar deal? Since Nixon ended the gold standard in 1971, the dollar no longer had gold backing it, and confidence in the currency began to falter, as I've already stated. America needed a new way to secure the dollar's value. The solution came in 1974 when the US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia, I believe I'm saying that country right, the world's largest oil exporter. Here was the deal. Saudi Arabia promised to sell its oil in only US dollars. It agreed to invest in extra profits, oil revenues, or petrodollars, into US banks and government bonds. 3. The United States promised to provide military protection for Saudi Arabia to supply them with advanced weapons and security support. So why did Saudi Arabia even agree to this deal? Well, think about it. The Middle East in the 1970s was super unstable. War tensions, a lot of drama. Saudi Arabia wanted to make sure they didn't get attacked or pushed around. The US basically said, we'll protect you, we'll give you our military, and give you the best weapons, all for just selling their oil in US dollar. Honestly, why wouldn't Saudi Arabia turn that deal down? It was kind of sort of basically free protection. #girl math. This arrangement meant that every country that wanted oil had to first exchange their currency for dollars. That's the petrodollar deal. Oil tied to the US dollar, backed by American military and economic power. Once the agreement was in place, every nation that needed oil had to first obtain the dollars, creating what became known as the petrodollar system. This arrangement restored global demand for the dollar and ensured its dominance in world trade. Now here's how it came to be. We all know that the US government didn't just have one motive for the deal. Obviously, there was money involved, of course, but there were bigger goals too, keeping power, influence, and control on a global stage. So the question is, was this deal mainly about money, or was it also about global power and politics? Anchoring oil to the US dollar meant that every nation had to hold dollars to buy oil. That kept demand for the currency high, which helped stabilize its value. This wasn't just random engineering, it created a systematic lifeline for the greenback as the world's reserve currency. The economist characterizes it as an unspoken agreement where the US offered military aid and brought however you say that, oil, indirectly reinforcing dollar demand through oil trade. In other words, if you wanted oil, you needed the US dollars. No dollars, no gas. The US basically turned the world's gas station into a dollars-only store. But the real flex was geopolitical. America promised Saudi Arabia full military protection and top-tier weapons. That deal gave Saudis security and gave the US dominance in the Middle East, putting America firmly in the driver's seat of the global energy market. Basically, the US turned the world's biggest necessity into a pay-to-play system. And guess who owned the arcade? We'll get more in depth in the why part. Stay with me. Saudi Arabia reinvested large portions of its oil revenue into US Treasury securities and markets, fueling US deficient spending and allowing continued borrowing. This flow of funds became a vital source of the capital for US government spending. This extended beyond an economic pact. It embedded the US in the Middle East security dynamics, reinforcing American power. Now, before I continue, deficient spending is basically the government borrows money to cover the gap between what it wants to spend versus what it actually has. This can be done by issuing government bonds or borrowing from other sources. The idea is that the government can keep programs running, fund projects, or stimulate the economy even when tax revenue isn't enough. AKA, it was deficient spending on steroids. The petrodollar system made sure the US could keep swiping the credit card without the bill coming due anytime soon. But since we're now in 2026, the bill will probably come within the next 5, 6, 7 decades. I'll explain how it affects us in a bit. Would you say the petrodollar system was created more as an economic plan or as a way for the US to control world affairs? In the book Bankruptcy of Our Nation by Jerry Robinson discusses how the US government's deficient spending was closely tied to the establishment of the petrodollar system. He explains that after the US abandoned the gold standard in 1971, it needed a way to maintain global demand for the dollar to support its spending habits. The petrodollar system, established in 1973, achieved this by ensuring that oil transactions were conducted exclusively in US dollars. And as we already know, this arrangement created a constant global demand for the dollar, which in turn allowed the US to finance its deficiencies more easily without facing immediate inflation or a loss of currency value, or much of that currency value back then. Let me rephrase. This arrangement, petrodollar system, gave the US government the excuse to print more money so that it could spend it without actually having a good, and in my opinion, real true worth. There's a reason why inflation is so high, because the dollar isn't worth as much as it used to be. And the more the government, the Fed, prints, the less value the US dollar has. Robinson highlights that this system is not only felicitated the US government's ability to exchange in deficient spending, but also reinforced the dollar's value as a world reserve currency by tying oil sales to the US dollar. The US ensured that countries around the world would need to hold significant reserves of dollar to exchange international trade. This strategic move provided the US with economic leverage and allowed for continued fiscal expansion without immediate constraints. Now, trying to fully understand, going to an example, the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. While the reported reason for invasion was the belief that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. Some people argue that it was Iraq's decision to sell oil in euros rather than US dollars. It's really the reason why the US attacked, unprovoked. This move threatened the petrodollar system, and the subsequent invasion could be seen as the way I see it, as to reinsert control over global oil trade and maintain the demand of the dollar's dominance. These actions show the true lanes to which the US has gone to protect its economic interests tied to oil and the petrodollar system. While not always involving direct military conflict, the strategic importance of oil and the US dollar has led to significant geopolitical intervention. Now it's time to look at the bigger picture, what it does. This system doesn't just affect America, it impacts how countries all over the world buy and sell goods, especially oil. By tying global oil trade to the US dollar, the petrodollar has changed the rules of international trade in ways most people don't even notice. So here's the question. How does the petrodollar system affect the way countries trade with each other? Any nation wanting to buy oil couldn't trade with their own currencies. Nations must go through the dollar. This setup doesn't just influence oil trade, it spills into all international trade. Because countries already have a stockpile of dollars for oil, they often just use dollars for other transactions too. The dollar became the default medium of exchange, not only for oil, but increasingly for the global trade of all types. This created an uneven playing field. The US can literally print more dollars while other nations must work, trade, or export goods to earn them. And as Robinson puts it, foreign countries are placed in the position of having to supply real goods and services in exchange for American paper dollars. The petrodollar system gives the US a unique advantage. It can finance trade deficits just by issuing more dollars. The petrodollar system basically turned the US into a big American boss at the top of the company. The government is the head honcho while the people are the minions doing the day-to-day work. But here's the twist. Unlike a normal boss who actually runs the business, Uncle Sam just prints out paychecks out of thin air, still gets total respect because the rest of the world needs those dollars to buy oil. It's literally like the ultimate workplace scam. The boss doesn't produce anything, but everyone still lines up for his paper. So that raises the question, how does this system make the US more powerful in the world? Now before I begin to answer this, let's go over some definitions. Because oil is sold in dollars worldwide, foreign countries always end up holding piles of US dollars. These are called dollar reserves. Dollar reserves are a key component of a country's overall foreign reserves, which central banks use to stabilize their own currency exchange rates, facilitate international trade and debt repayments, safeguard against potential financial crises. An IOU stands for IOU. It is a simple document or note that expresses that a person or entity owes money to someone else. Unlike a formal loan agreement, IOUs usually do not include detailed repayment terms, interest rates, or legal enforcement measures, but they serve as a record of the debt and the intention to repay it. Treasury bonds are literally just formal IOUs. They say lend us money now and we'll pay you back later, plus a little bit extra. Foreign governments, banks, and investors buy these because they're thought to be safe, and because they need money to buy oil and other stuff on the international market. Well, when the US system wants to spend more than it actually takes in, deficient spending, instead the Treasury issues bonds, basically IOUs. These bonds are then sold to foreign governments and investors. Treasury securities are how the US borrows money when it spends more than it collects. Other countries, which already have a lot of US dollars from trade in oil, often use these dollars to buy the US debt. Because oil is priced in dollars, countries all over the world are sitting on huge dollar reserves. They can't just let those dollars sit there doing nothing. So they recycle them back into the US by purchasing treasury bonds. Robinson points out that this cycle, petrodollars coming back into the US debt market, is what allows the US government to keep financing deficits year after year. He says the petrodollar system creates an endless demand for US treasuries, giving Washington a credit card with virtually no limit. So in plain English, the US prints dollars, other countries need those dollars for oil. Then they turn around and lend them back to the US by buying bonds. This is what makes America uniquely powerful. No other country can run up massive debt and still have the world happily finance it. Let's also not forget the example earlier, the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. The reported reason for the invasion was the belief of weapons of mass destruction. Some people argue that it was Iraq's decision to sell oil in euros rather than US dollars. Now, the petrodollar system enabled the US to have power far beyond what most countries could ever achieve by making oil sales tied to the dollar. It guaranteed America a constant global demand for its currency that kept its debt machine running smoothly. But that raises an important point. What about the oil-producing countries themselves? Sure, they got steady sales, US military protection, and access to American markets. But was that really an equal trade, or was the real winner the United States, which gained both the economic dominance over geopolitical leverage? Do oil-producing countries actually benefit from this system, or does the US benefit the most? Oil-producing countries did benefit, but not nearly at the same scale as the US. They got guaranteed buyers for the oil, since the world had no choice but to buy in dollars. Nations like Saudi Arabia receive massive military protection and top-tier weapon systems that probably can cause mass destruction that they reportedly attacked Iraq for. I know. Oil sales pumped billions into their economies, helping them modernize quickly, which won't be for the US benefit for long when they realize they probably don't actually need America. Since they modernized and developed while us lazy consuming Americans don't produce anything, but instead order stuff off of Shein and Temu. Meanwhile, the US got to print dollars at will knowing the world would need them, without worrying about gold reserves. With the petrodollar system, it created endless demand for the US treasuries, which let America fund huge deficits. It cemented the dollar as the world's reserve currency, giving the US unmatched global financial power. In other words, granting it financial hegemony no other nation could claim. So it does benefit other nations, but it benefits the US more. But it will only benefit the US more for so long. Just wait until they either 1, call in their debt, 2, modernize so highly that they can overthrow the US, 3, realize they don't actually really need the US. How does the petrodollar system affect everyday Americans, like gas prices, the cost of living, or inflation? Because oil is priced in US dollars, Americans can get a kind of built-in discount. If oil were priced in any other currency, Americans would have to exchange dollars into, say, euros, making gas more expensive at the pump. We can simply print the money the world must use to buy it because of petrodollar system. It allows Washington to borrow and spend far beyond its means, which pops up government programs and consumer credit that creates an illusion of prosperity. But Robinson warns us it comes at a price: inflation. He says that, quote, by exporting our inflation abroad through the petrodollar system, America has enjoyed cheap goods and services for decades, but this cannot last forever, end quote. Inflation is like a hidden tax. The US can get away with printing more money because other countries are stuck holding dollars in their reserve, or as some say, forced. But the more dollars we create, the less each one is worth. Petrodollar kept gas and imports cheaper than they otherwise would be, but it also fuels debt and inflation, leaving us vulnerable when the system finally shifts. Yes, it will shift. This raises the question, could the rise of other currencies like China's yuan threaten the petrodollar system? The petrodollar system isn't permanent, and rival currencies like the Chinese yuan could eventually challenge the dollar's role. As China grows its economy and expands trade, it has been pushing for oil and other commodities to be priced in yuan instead of dollars. Yes, that's really and supposedly already happening. If nations begin accepting alternative currencies, then the dollar's reserve status would unravel quickly. If oil exporters started taking yuan, euros, or a basket of currencies, fewer countries would need to hold dollar reserves. Robinson explains that would reduce the demand for treasuries and would limit America's ability to borrow and spend freely. And that means a lot for the US, since we're a consumer nation. Honestly, not considering what I'm about to tell you guys next, this doesn't really worry me too much because it gets rid of Washington's credit card. And the US would be able to learn to support itself and make its own stuff, instead of relying and buying stuff from China that we don't even need. It would teach the US discipline and hopefully get rid of the corrupted leaders. We'd probably become more of what we used to be, more aligned with the Constitution. So say if the petrodollar ended tomorrow, what big changes would we see in our daily lives? Well, let me start off first by saying, since countries like China own huge amounts of the US debt, treasury bonds, that gives them leverage. Robinson writes, quote, should China or any major holder of treasuries decide to dump their holdings or demand repayment, America would be thrust into a financial crisis overnight. In other words, if China got so fed up with our BS, cashed in, the US dollar would tank, interest rates would skyrocket, and the US economy would be cooked, baked, fried, chopped, burned, all of the above. If the petrodollar system ended tomorrow, the US would have to compete with other countries for oil using dollars or convert to other currencies, likely making gas much more expensive. At this point, we should start making our own oil, like for real. So if you think that $5 per gallon of gas is expensive, just remember that it could be a lot more, especially because we don't even need all those dollars in the system. The dollar's value is essentially backed up by nothing, and because the Fed overspending and printing so much, what little faith people have in the dollar's worth is already chopped in half by so much. Look at the top of the dollar, it literally says Federal Reserve. No. Another thing, your Temu Rolex watch and high-rise bootcut jeans and many imported goods would become pricier because foreign countries might demand payment in their own currency rather than dollars. This would directly affect the cost of electronics, clothing, and other everyday items. So y'all should really stock up now. You really never have too much of anything, especially Bibles. Just a side note, the dollar is worth 13 cents or probably less now since we're in 2026. With less global demand for the dollar, its value could drop. The petrodollar system delays the pain of inflation, so without it, the prices for groceries, rent, and services could rise faster. Without foreign countries buying the US Treasury to recycle their dollars, the government would have to pay higher interest to attract lenders. That would make loans, mortgages, and credit card rates much more expensive for Americans. Oh, and don't forget the economic uncertainty. The US will lose some financial leverage globally, making it harder to borrow, spend, and influence international trade. So without further ado, here are some questions for you and my take on them. 1. Do you think the petrodollar system is more about keeping the world stable or about the US having control? For me, it's not really about keeping the world stable, it's about keeping the US stable and having control because the US is unstable, which is partly due to the reason of the downfall of the Bretton Woods system. 2. Should Americans keep protecting the system or should we start preparing for a life without it? I think for as long as we can, we should protect and keep protecting the system, but stop overspending so much and stop printing. Maybe even stop charging interest, though we should also prepare for life without it because it's going to happen. 3. If the petrodollar system disappears, who do you think will gain the most power and who will lose the most power? Because China has bought so much of the US debt, treasury bonds, it's obvious that China will have the most power, and because the US has so much debt, it's obvious that the US will lose the most. And that's the petrodollar system, folks. America's system, keeping us buying oil, printing money, and quietly running the world's financial game. Oil nations got some perks, sure, but the real power play has been the US. Next time you're at the pump or checking your bank account, ask yourself, do you ever really think about it? Every dollar, every drop of grass, every price tag is part of a story most of us never notice. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and I'll catch you guys on the next episode.